In the winter of 1221, along the cold banks of the Indus River, one empire reached the edge of survival. Behind them stood mountains burned by war. Ahead of them moved one of the most efficient killing machines in human history. There was nowhere left to retreat. The army of the Khwarazmian prince Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu had been running for months. Cities had collapsed behind him one after another. Fortresses that once guarded the Eastern Islamic world had vanished beneath smoke and ash. Entire populations had disappeared into silence. And somewhere behind that destruction rode Genghis Khan, not as a distant ruler issuing commands from a throne far away, but as a commander personally leading the pursuit. For years, the Mongols had advanced across Asia with terrifying speed. Kingdoms that had resisted them had shattered. Armies larger than theirs had dissolved in confusion before they could even organize resistance. The Mongols did not move like the traditional armies of the medieval world. They did not depend on slow supply trains or fixed roads. They carried mobility itself into war. And by 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire, once one of the largest and wealthiest Islamic states in the world, had already begun to collapse under that pressure. Only one major force remained intact: Jalal ad-Din's army. To later generations, the Battle of the Indus River would appear almost impossible to explain. Medieval chroniclers described a Mongol army of perhaps 20,000 defeating a force many times larger. Some Islamic writers portrayed the final battle as a heroic last stand. Mongol accounts emphasized inevitability, the unavoidable destruction of another enemy who had failed to understand the nature of steppe warfare. But the reality was more complicated. The battle on the Indus was not simply a contest of numbers. It was the final stage of a long strategic collapse. To understand why Jalal ad-Din found himself trapped against the river, it is necessary to go back several years earlier, to a moment when the Mongols and the Khwarazmian Empire were not yet enemies. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Khwarazmian Empire stretched across enormous territory. Under Shah Muhammad II, it controlled much of Persia, Transoxiana, and Central Asia. Rich trade cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench connected caravan routes between east and west. The empire possessed wealth, manpower, and strategic depth. On paper, it appeared powerful enough to resist almost any invasion, but beneath that surface, serious fractures already existed. The empire had expanded rapidly, often faster than its political institutions could stabilize. Regional governors competed for influence. Loyalty to the central government varied across provinces. The Shah himself ruled through suspicion and fear, constantly worried about rivals within his own court. His relationship with his own mother, Turkan Khatun, had become especially destructive. She maintained her own political network inside the empire and often interfered directly in state affairs. Administrative authority became divided between competing centers of power. This instability mattered because the Mongols did not simply defeat armies through battlefield strength. They identified weakness inside political systems and widened those fractures until resistance collapsed from within. At first, Genghis Khan had little interest in conquering the Khwarazmian Empire. His early campaigns focused primarily on consolidating control over the steppe and northern China. Trade with the Islamic world offered economic advantages. Diplomatic contact between the Mongols and Khwarazmians initially remained peaceful. Then came the incident at Otrar. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan entered the border city of Otrar. The governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of espionage. Whether the accusation was genuine paranoia or deliberate provocation remains unclear, but the governor seized the caravan and executed many of its members. Genghis Khan responded carefully at first. He did not immediately launch an invasion. Instead, he sent diplomats demanding punishment for the governor and compensation for the incident. The Shah made a catastrophic decision. Rather than de-escalate the crisis, he executed one of the Mongol envoys and humiliated the others. In the political culture of the steppe, this was not merely an insult. It was a direct violation of diplomatic law and personal honor. The possibility of peaceful relations ended immediately. What followed was one of the most devastating military campaigns of the medieval world. In 1219, Mongol armies crossed into Khwarazmian territory from multiple directions simultaneously. The scale and coordination of the invasion stunned defenders. Cities that expected long sieges found Mongol cavalry already operating behind them. Communication between regional commanders broke down rapidly. The Shah struggled to organize coherent resistance. Instead of concentrating his forces, he dispersed them across fortified cities, believing strong walls would slow the Mongols down. It was a fatal misunderstanding. The Mongols did not fear sieges. By this stage, they had already absorbed Chinese engineers and siege specialists into their armies. They combined mobility with increasingly sophisticated siege capabilities. Cities isolated from each other became vulnerable one by one. Bukhara fell. Then Samarkand. Each collapse created panic across neighboring regions. Refugees flooded roads. Garrisons abandoned positions. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. In many cases, cities surrendered before major fighting even began because stories of Mongol massacres had already destroyed morale. Psychological warfare became as important as military force. Genghis Khan understood that fear could move faster than cavalry. Meanwhile, Shah Muhammad retreated continuously westward, unable to stabilize the situation. His authority deteriorated with every withdrawal. Provincial leaders increasingly focused on their own survival rather than coordinated defense. He died in 1220 on an island in the Caspian Sea, isolated and defeated. The empire did not entirely disappear with him. His son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, emerged as the last major figure capable of organizing resistance. Unlike his father, Jalal ad-Din possessed genuine military ability and personal courage. Even hostile chroniclers often acknowledged his determination. He understood that passive defense had failed catastrophically. Fixed cities had become traps. Static warfare favored the Mongols. So he attempted something different. Mobility. Instead of waiting behind walls, Jalal ad-Din gathered surviving troops and maneuvered aggressively through Afghanistan and eastern Persia. Around him collected fragments of a broken empire: Turkic cavalry, Persian infantry, tribal levies, mercenaries, refugees, surviving officers from destroyed armies. It was not a unified force in the traditional sense. It was a coalition held together by desperation. Yet for the first time since the Mongol invasion began, resistance started to harden. In 1221, Jalal ad-Din achieved an important victory against a Mongol detachment near Parwan. The battle did not destroy Mongol power, but it proved something psychologically significant. The Mongols could bleed. News spread rapidly across the region. For populations living under terror and uncertainty, the victory carried enormous symbolic weight. Some local groups began reconsidering resistance. Survivors from destroyed armies rallied toward Jalal ad-Din's banner, but success brought new problems. His coalition remained fragile. Rivalries between commanders intensified after the victory. Disputes over captured loot reportedly caused serious divisions inside the army. Tribal leaders distrusted one another. Maintaining unity under constant pressure became increasingly difficult. And Genghis Khan himself now entered the campaign directly. This changed everything. The Mongol ruler rarely pursued enemies personally unless he considered them strategically important. Jalal ad-Din had become more than another fleeing prince. He represented the possibility of organized resistance re-emerging inside territories the Mongols believed already conquered. That possibility had to be eliminated completely, so the pursuit began. Across harsh terrain stretching through modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, Jalal ad-Din retreated southward with Mongol forces closing behind him. The speed of movement was relentless. Mongol cavalry advanced across mountains, deserts, and river valleys with astonishing endurance. Every delay became dangerous. Every lost supply route mattered. The retreat itself slowly consumed Jalal ad-Din's army. Large medieval forces moving through devastated territory faced enormous logistical strain. Food shortages worsened. Horses weakened. Cohesion deteriorated. Refugees attached themselves to the columns, slowing movement further. Still, the prince continued south. His objective was survival. Beyond the Indus River lay the Indian subcontinent, territory outside immediate Mongol control. If he could cross the river with enough troops intact, he might rebuild power elsewhere and continue resistance in the future. But the geography itself created a trap. The Indus was not an easy defensive barrier to cross quickly with a massive army. Seasonal conditions affected river depth and current. Crossing points were limited. Organizing movement under pursuit required time Jalal ad-Din no longer possessed. Behind him came Genghis Khan. Not recklessly, not blindly. The Mongols maintained pressure carefully, avoiding unnecessary risks, while denying their enemy opportunities to recover. Reconnaissance riders monitored movements constantly. Advance units harassed the retreat. Escape routes narrowed with every passing day. By late 1221, Jalal ad-Din's army finally reached the banks of the Indus River. Exhausted soldiers crowded the shoreline beside civilians, camp followers, animals, supply wagons, and surviving officers from a dying empire. Ahead of them flowed the river. Behind them, dust clouds began rising on the horizon. The Mongols had arrived. The final battlefield was not chosen through careful planning. It was imposed by exhaustion, geography, and pursuit. By the time Jalal ad-Din reached the Indus River in late 1221, his army had already endured months of continuous retreat through collapsing territory. Men arrived at the river carrying the physical weight of multiple campaigns. Horses had crossed mountains, dry plains, and ruined settlements without stable supply lines. Many units no longer resembled organized formations from a functioning state army. They were survivors moving beside one another because separation meant destruction. And yet the force gathering at the riverbank was still immense. Medieval chroniclers offered wildly different numbers for Jalal ad-Din's army. Some Islamic sources described more than 100,000 soldiers accompanying him. Mongol accounts generally reduce the figure. Exact numbers remain impossible to verify, but what mattered strategically was not precision. It was scale. Jalal ad-Din still commanded a force substantially larger than the Mongol army pursuing him. But numbers concealed dangerous realities. His troops came from different ethnic groups, regions, and military traditions. Turkic cavalry rode beside Persian infantry. Tribal contingents answered primarily to their own leaders, rather than centralized command structures. Many had joined only recently after earlier Khwarazmian armies collapsed elsewhere. Some fought for loyalty, some for survival, others simply because no safe territory remained. The army also carried the burden of refugees, servants, merchants, wounded soldiers, and families fleeing Mongol advance. Medieval armies often moved with enormous non-combat populations attached to them, and under retreat conditions those columns became even more chaotic. The Mongols understood this vulnerability immediately. For Genghis Khan, battlefield victory did not depend on matching enemy numbers. The critical question was whether an opposing army could maintain cohesion under pressure. If fear, exhaustion, and confusion disrupted coordination, numerical superiority could become meaningless. That principle had guided Mongol warfare for years. The army following Jalal ad-Din toward the Indus was relatively small by comparison, perhaps around 20,000 mounted troops. But these were not inexperienced frontier warriors. They were hardened campaign veterans operating under commanders who had spent years fighting across Central Asia. They moved with discipline that other medieval armies struggled to achieve. Every Mongol cavalryman effectively functioned as both mounted archer and maneuver unit. Communication systems using flags, horns, and prearranged signals allowed rapid coordination during battle. Units trained to disperse and regroup quickly without collapsing into confusion. Most importantly, the Mongol army operated as a unified structure. Jalal ad-Din's coalition did not. Genghis Khan also possessed advantages beyond battlefield tactics alone. His forces maintained superior reconnaissance capability. Long before direct engagement began, Mongol scouts already understood terrain conditions, troop movement, and possible escape routes. The battlefield itself favored mobility only partially. The Indus River created a massive natural obstacle behind Jalal ad-Din's position. Steep sections of riverbank restricted movement. Dense concentrations of soldiers and refugees compressed available space. Any attempt at retreat risked turning into panic, but the terrain also contained open ground suitable for cavalry maneuvering. That meant the Mongols could still exploit speed and coordination while simultaneously trapping their enemy against the river. For Jalal ad-Din, the situation produced an impossible dilemma. Crossing the river safely required time and order. Standing still invited encirclement. Attempting immediate crossing with such a large force risked catastrophic disorder before battle even began. Some accounts suggest partial crossings may already have been underway before the Mongols arrived. Others imply preparations remained incomplete. What is certain is that Jalal ad-Din failed to move his entire force across before contact became unavoidable. He would have to fight. The psychological atmosphere inside the Khwarazmian camp must have been unbearable. Most soldiers already knew what happened to armies defeated by the Mongols. This was no longer an unknown enemy. Across Central Asia, entire cities had vanished after resistance failed. Stories of mass executions traveled with refugees from every direction. Fear inside medieval warfare was rarely abstract. It was personal. Men entering battle near the Indus understood that defeat might mean annihilation, not only for themselves, but for their families standing nearby along the riverbank, and somewhere across the approaching plain rode Genghis Khan himself. His presence mattered enormously. The Mongol ruler was not simply a distant symbol. He represented continuity of command and certainty of purpose. By 1221, his reputation alone carried strategic power. Enemies often entered battle psychologically weakened before fighting even began. Still, Jalal ad-Din remained determined to resist. Unlike his father, who had retreated continuously during the collapse of the empire, Jalal ad-Din repeatedly demonstrated willingness to engage directly. Contemporary chroniclers often described him as physically courageous to the point of recklessness. That courage now became essential, because once battle started, cohesion inside his army would depend heavily on visible leadership. The Mongols approached carefully. This was not a reckless frontal assault against a numerically larger force trapped at desperation point. Genghis Khan understood the dangers of cornered enemies. Armies with no escape routes sometimes fought with extreme intensity. So the Mongols advanced methodically, probing weaknesses while preserving maneuver flexibility. Dust rose across the plain as cavalry formations spread outward. Mounted archers moved into harassment range first. Then the battle began. The opening stages likely resembled many previous Mongol engagements. Waves of horse archers attacking at distance, testing reactions, drawing defenders into premature movement. Arrows disrupted formations, while cavalry avoided prolonged close combat. This style of warfare created enormous psychological strain. Traditional medieval armies often preferred decisive collision lines meeting directly in concentrated combat. Mongol tactics denied that clarity. Enemies found themselves constantly reacting to movement rather than controlling engagement. At the Indus, that pressure became even more dangerous because space behind Jalal ad-Din's army remained limited. Any backward movement risked crushing troops against the riverbank. Jalal ad-Din attempted to stabilize his lines through aggressive resistance. Some sources suggest he placed stronger troops at critical points to resist Mongol flanking maneuvers. Others describe repeated cavalry counterattacks intended to disrupt mounted archers before they could dominate the field. For a time, the resistance held. The Khwarazmian army still possessed experienced cavalry units capable of serious combat. These were not defenseless militias collapsing instantly at first contact. Many had fought through years of warfare already, but Mongol command structure remained vastly superior under battlefield stress. As pressure intensified, coordination inside Jalal ad-Din's coalition began deteriorating. Communication across large medieval armies was always difficult. Under missile fire, dust, noise, and confusion, localized panic could spread rapidly before commanders even understood where collapse had started. The Mongols exploited that perfectly. Rather than seeking one massive breakthrough immediately, they attacked cohesion itself. Feigned retreats may have drawn sections of Jalal ad-Din's cavalry out of position. Concentrated arrow fire weakened isolated units. Constant maneuver forced commanders to respond faster than fragmented structures allowed. The battle slowly fragmented into disconnected struggles across the field. And once fragmentation began, the numerical advantage of Jalal ad-Din's army became increasingly irrelevant. Large armies required organization to function effectively. Without coordination, density became a liability. Units blocked one another's movement. Orders failed to spread properly. Retreating formations collided with advancing ones. Near the river, conditions worsened further. Non-combatants crowded rear areas. Horses panicked under missile fire. Wagons and supply animals obstructed movement routes. Dust reduced visibility. The sound of battle echoed against the water, while Mongol cavalry continued pressing from multiple directions. The psychological pressure must have been extraordinary. Many soldiers likely could no longer see the full battlefield. Medieval combat often reduced awareness to immediate survival noise, exhaustion, sudden movement, rumors spreading faster than facts, and rumors kill armies. Once enough soldiers believe collapse has begun, discipline starts disintegrating even before defeat becomes militarily inevitable. Some portions of Jalal ad-Din's force fought fiercely throughout the engagement. Chroniclers from multiple traditions acknowledged strong resistance in sections of the battlefield, but isolated bravery could not compensate for strategic entrapment. The Mongols retained initiative continuously. Their cavalry moved faster between pressure points. Their command hierarchy adapted more effectively under changing conditions. Smaller, disciplined formations repeatedly overwhelmed larger, but less coordinated enemy concentrations. Then came the decisive phase. At some point during the battle, Mongol attacks began driving sections of Jalal ad-Din's army directly toward the river itself. Whether through deliberate encirclement or cumulative battlefield pressure, retreat space collapsed rapidly. Panic spread. Soldiers attempting escape crowded the banks. Horses slipped on uneven ground. Some men tried swimming the river immediately despite armor and heavy equipment. Others became trapped between advancing Mongols and the water. Once organized retreat dissolved into uncontrolled flight, the battle effectively ended. What followed became slaughter. Mongol cavalry excelled at pursuit warfare. In many ways, pursuit was where they inflicted maximum destruction. Broken armies, moving without formation, became extraordinarily vulnerable to mounted archers and fast cavalry attacks. At the Indus, thousands were reportedly killed either during direct combat or while attempting river crossings. Yet in the middle of collapse, one scene would survive in historical memory more vividly than almost anything else from the battle. Jalal ad-Din himself refused surrender. As Mongol forces closed around the remaining defenders near the riverbank, the Khwarazmian prince made a desperate decision. According to multiple chroniclers, he rode his horse directly toward a steep section overlooking the Indus and leapt into the river below. It was an astonishing act. Not because it reversed the battle. It did not, but because it symbolized absolute refusal to submit, even at the moment of total defeat. The river current carried him away from the battlefield, while surviving followers attempted to escape alongside him. From the opposite bank, Genghis Khan reportedly watched the escape personally. Even hostile Mongol sources later described admiration for Jalal ad-Din's courage. But admiration did not change the outcome. The army behind him was collapsing completely, and along the banks of the Indus River, the final organized resistance of the Khwarazmian Empire was being destroyed. The moment Jalal ad-Din entered the Indus River did not end the battle. It marked the point where the battle ceased to have structure at all. On the riverbank, what remained of the Khwarazmian army was no longer operating as a coordinated force. It had become a scattering of isolated survival attempts unfolding simultaneously across a shrinking strip of ground. Some units still fought in pockets of resistance, maintaining discipline long after command cohesion had dissolved. Others were already breaking apart under pressure, trying to escape toward any available crossing point, regardless of order or formation. Behind them, the Mongols continued to advance with methodical control. What made Mongol pursuit warfare so devastating in moments like this was not just speed. It was discipline after victory had already become inevitable. Many medieval armies would lose cohesion once the enemy began retreating. Mongol forces did the opposite. They increased control, tightened formation spacing, and transformed collapse into systematic destruction. There was no emotional release in their pursuit, only continuation of procedure. The Indus River itself became an extension of the battlefield. Men who attempted to escape across it encountered a second layer of destruction. Drowning soldiers weighed down by armor, horses struggling against strong currents, and exhausted survivors pulled under by panic rather than enemy weapons. In medieval river crossings under pursuit, death rarely came from a single cause. It came from exhaustion, equipment, and confusion acting together. On the riverbank, organized resistance faded rapidly. What followed was fragmentation at every level. Command structures collapsed as officers were separated from their troops. Communication broke down entirely. In many cases, soldiers could no longer distinguish between retreat routes and areas already occupied by Mongol cavalry. Dust, noise, and movement created a battlefield where visibility itself became unreliable. The psychological condition of the Khwarazmian army at this stage is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but patterns from similar Mongol engagements suggest a consistent sequence. First came uncertainty, then localized panic, then the belief that the entire army had already been defeated, even when isolated units were still fighting. Once that belief spread, cohesion disintegrated faster than casualties alone could explain. This is one of the most important aspects of Mongol warfare that traditional numerical accounts often fail to capture. The collapse of a medieval army was not a linear process measured purely in dead or surviving soldiers. It was a psychological cascade. Once enough units began retreating simultaneously, even intact formations found themselves pulled into disorder. At the Indus River, that cascade reached its final stage. Jalal ad-Din's decision to cross the river, whether fully deliberate or forced by battlefield pressure, removed the only remaining focal point of unified command. His presence had functioned as a psychological anchor for the coalition army. Once he disappeared into the river, no equivalent leadership structure remained to stabilize resistance. The result was rapid disintegration. Some chroniclers describe sections of the army continuing to fight stubbornly until the very end. Others emphasize mass casualties during attempted escape. Both perspectives can coexist without contradiction. In battles of this scale and condition, different parts of the same army often experienced entirely different endings depending on timing and location. What is consistent across sources is the completeness of the collapse. By the time Mongol forces secured control of the battlefield, the Khwarazmian army as a functional entity had ceased to exist. But the meaning of the battle did not lie only in the destruction of troops. It lay in what this destruction represented.